Thank you, Jack. Dear friends and colleagues. As I mentioned yesterday, it's more than 2 years since I participated in dialogue seminars. I participated to the first, the third, and the fifth. The fifth was in Dhaka city in March 2013. And it's wonderful to be back and listen to the progress and the declining levels and how the spirit is changing. And it's close to the strange to then remind you of the persistent problems in Norway, nearly 30 years after Chernobyl. And many of you will know much of this from earlier. Some of you will see lots of new things, and there is something new for everyone. There's something that's never been presented before. The first, a quick reminder of the Chernobyl fallout in Europe, and then in Norway, with the highest levels in central Norway and the mountainous areas in the southern Norway. This is the southern range of the Sami reindeer herding area, which covers most of northern Scandinavia. This area we have non-Sami reindeer husbandry, and there is also lots of farming, animal husbandry. The fallout from Chernobyl in Norway wasn't high enough to make external doses a serious concern, so I just included a little bit of work that was done as late as in 1992, 6 years after the accident. The first detailed dosimeter studies were performed here in the most contaminated area of these summer farms in the mountainous areas in southern Norway. Much of the reason I think that external doses were not focused on in Norway is the persistent focus during many decades on radon, the radon problem. But of course you see also that average deposition levels were not really high compared to here. So the Chernobyl challenge in Norway was mainly on grazing animal production in natural, unimproved mountain and forest pastures, really shallow soils, nutrient poor, traditional grazing of both cattle and sheep and goats, and of course reindeer. So animal production, and then of course the consumers of wild products. I was asked during lunch about the freshwater fish in Norway, and so I just checked the latest values. Freshwater fish was a huge concern the first years. We had the highest concentrations, were tens of thousands of becquerels per kilogram of cesium in lakes, not in rivers. The concentrations were lower in rivers than in lakes. And the current levels are then down to some hundred. Maybe in a couple of lakes there are still 1,000 becquerels per kilogram, but in most lakes the levels are much lower. So the problems are persistent in animal production, particularly with reindeer and sheep grazing. And here is the data. Sorry, I understand from this morning's session that not all of you like figures and data, but my presentation is full of them. Sorry. I also learned from this morning's session that the next time I serve drunk reindeer, I should inform you of the contamination level. So here you see that this is just cesium-137. So with the initial levels of around 35,000 becquerels per kilogram, and then you can add the cesium-134 in addition. Decreasing relatively quickly the first years. The dotted line here is the current permissible level for cesium in reindeer meat in Norway. And here is the value of the results from last autumn, 2014, when Mrs. Ando and Mrs. Kano was visiting Norway, and and were visiting the Vågå reindeer herders when they were slaughtering, and the maximum levels at this point was 8,200 becquerels per kilogram. They had more than 800 animals that they could not slaughter in September. They had to postpone until the winter. And also last autumn, there were really high levels in sheep and lamb in some areas, with maximum levels of 4,500 becquerels per kilogram, and farmers had to clean feed their sheep for 8 weeks before they could be slaughtered. So the strategy in Norway after Chernobyl was then establishing many local monitoring stations. These were official municipality finance stations and local food control offices mainly. Had more than 50 stations at the maximum. Now it's declined and will be around 5 larger regional stations. Also we had the local monitoring of animals before slaughter, focused on the control of the animals. We had no control of fodder in Norway. So we controlled the animals and then applied season binders and clean feeding if necessary. And then for the consumers, focused on the consumers of our products, we focused on the dietary advice. And then for the selected groups, we provided local monitoring. It's live monitoring of sheep and reindeer. And already a year after the accident, the health authorities published a dietary advice leaflet with advice on quantities, how much to eat, on food with different contamination levels, advice on preparation, boiling, salting, and it all focused on the annual intake and not on the permissible levels, with the aim of reducing doses to ingestion doses to below 1 millisievert per year. And here is an extract of the table in the leaflet showing the contamination levels examples. If your food contains 600 becquerels per kilogram, you could eat around 100 kilograms a year, corresponding to around 10 meals a week. And up to 20,000 becquerels per kilogram in the food, you could have 3 kilograms a year, around a meal per month. That was the focus for those people who really depended on the contaminated food in the household. And then having the local stations, the possibility, and where all people could come and have their food and their animals under control, and having the dietary advice, then as been mentioned earlier here as well, that the body measurements are then can be used as a control of the efforts you make to reduce your intake. And many of you have seen this graph before. It's the cesium in the body of the reindeer herders going back to the 60s. The Swedes started monitoring the Samis before we did in Norway. So we started in northern Norway in 1965, and here are then the post-Chernobyl values. Indeed, in this era, there was no focus on doses or countermeasures. This was a pure monitoring thing, observation of time trends and levels. After Chernobyl, it's been much more control of what people have been doing. And again, the dotted line is around a millisievert per year. And then, as been mentioned a couple of times during this seminar, these average values, they are, of course, they don't represent any person. There's no average person. So here is some of the new data. It's oops. I selected the data for a wife and her husband. They after Chernobyl, the increase the first years. The first year after Chernobyl, they were offered clean reindeer meat from other areas in Norway. So that, together with the time it takes to build up towards some kind of equilibrium with your intake, is the reason for the lower levels the first years. And then after the maximum levels in 1990, they decided we have to do something to control our intake. And the wife here has been involved in the monitoring of reindeer during all these years. So they started checking the reindeer, monitoring and selected for their own consumption the least contaminated animals. So as long as they pick an animal, monitor if it's below 1,000 becquerels per kilogram, they eat it, and that's why then you have relatively stable levels during the 20 years since 1992. Really. Another challenge then with this long-lasting contamination problem is, of course, that we get new generations coming into the problem or inheriting the problem. And here's then a family who moved into this area in 2002 or 3. And they had a son in 2002, they had another child in 2006. They were careful in the first years, we didn't monitor them. And at this time they had the food, the reindeer meat from the areas where they came from originally, which were less contaminated. Then they came for the monitoring in 2006. And they were relieved by the relatively low levels, and then you see they started eating more of the local meat. And you see that they increase, you see the similar pattern in the wife and the husband. It changes similarly. You see the increase in the boy as he grows, his intake increases, his cesium excretion decreases, the biological half-life is increasing with age. So you see the levels in the boy increases. But then now he is in junior high, in a special Sami boarding school, so he's away from home 5 days a week. So he eats less of his family's meat, and he has lower levels. And you see that these levels, the father then, he's then between 2 and 300 becquerels per kilogram in his body. And by the way, we were talking about data, values, units. We are talking, when we talk about the levels in the people, we also talk about becquerels per kilogram. And we keep discussing if we should talk about becquerels per kilogram or becquerels in total. And I know my colleagues in Finland who are also monitoring reindeer herders. They operate in becquerels total because the reindeer herders say that if you calculate in becquerels per kilograms, it sounds like a meat. But we keep the becquerels per kilogram just to avoid saying that a small person has a lower level than a huge person, just because of the effect of the size. And then we try to say to these people, even though you see that the relatively high levels, that there are easy ways to reduce your levels, reduce your intake, control your meat, or clean feed your animal. But if that bothers you, thinking about this, doing these actions, then relax. Because the stress, worries, anxiety related to these levels are probably, or likely, easily could be more unhealthy than the effect of the becquerels in science. Then also, both in Jack's summary yesterday and in this morning session, we mentioned this, the balance between human dimension and a scientific interest in the monitoring and the data. And as professionals in radiation protection, we keep coming back to this question. When we go there and do the monitoring, do we recall the memories and the worries that these people have about the accident and the consequences? Already in 1996, the very first time I went to do the monitoring, I was interviewed by a journalist who asked me, and he said, well, now it's 10 years in Chernobyl, are you not just coming here and reminding these people of something they want to forget? Now it's nearly 30 years since. So we wonder if we really do more good than harm doing these measurements. But luckily, and then I was relieved, and then we did the monitoring now in March, got this very clear message from a nurse who is working in the Sami health and psychiatry. And she said, I don't think the national health authorities really understand and appreciate how important the long-term monitoring and education by NRPA and the staff has been for the understanding of the situation and the feeling of control for the mental well-being. And I think, in the Japanese perspective, I think it's important that we don't change positions every second year. Thank you.